Hey everybody, this is the first chapter and the stuff at the beginning of the book of Marx After Sraffa by Ian Steedman. This book was published with New Left Books in 1977. The table of contents of the book says, Chapter 1, which I'm reading here, Principal Issues and Underlying Assumptions, with the headings, the issues involved, the significance of these issues, underlying assumptions, capitalist commodity economies, production, reproduction, labor time, value, money and price, wages, the obscurantist response, the composite allegation, the allegation is specious, the structure of the present work. Chapter 2 is titled the quote transformation problem. With the headings, Marx's quote solution is logically inconsistent, transformation of input prices, alternative solutions, why are people afraid of the alternative solutions? Conclusion. Chapter 3, value, price, and profit, the methods of production and the real wage, value and surplus value, the transformation of value and surplus value, the rate of profit and prices, a warning about gold money, principal conclusions. Chapter 4, value, price, and profit further considered. With the headings, the determination of the rate of profit, aliter, further remarks, where am I? Values, the rate of surplus value, exploitation and profits, Marx's formulation of the question, a spurious impression, choice of technique, conclusion. Chapter 5, an alternative presentation, the dated labor analysis. With the headings, dated labor analysis and the physical quantities approach, some implications, conclusion. Chapter 6, within the labor process, the headings, a very simple economy, a generalization, fixed capital, conclusion. Chapter 7, heterogeneous labor, with the headings, two kinds of labor, many kinds of labor, the rate of profit, conclusion appendix. Chapter 8, miscellanea, with the headings, further on the rate of profit, differential wages, the timing of wage payments, the wage rate and the rate of exploitation, a role for value magnitudes, pure circulation. Chapter 9 is titled a falling rate of profit, 1, with the headings 1, mutual consistency of Marx's expectations, the framework, the real wage, a falling rate of profit, Section 2, some critical remarks. Section 3, the alternative framework. Appendix, the composition of capital. Chapter 10, fixed capital, with the headings, Marx's treatment of value depreciation, a simple fixed capital using economy, an example with rising efficiency, Marx's value calculation, correct value accounting, an example with falling efficiency, profits and prices of production, choice of technique, conclusion. Chapter 11, positive profits with negative surplus value, the assumption, the price system, the quantity system, the value system, discussion, an implicit assumption, conclusion. Chapter 12, an analysis of fixed capital and joint production, with the headings, the output matrix, direct and indirect production requirements, the rate of profit, further on the rate of profit, Exploitation. Marx's formula for the rate of profit. Variations within the labor process. Heterogeneous labor. Differential profit rates. The turnover of capital. Chapter 13. The determination of labor allocation. With the headings: the choice of production methods. A simple example. Morishima's analysis of surplus labor. The general case. The quote, law of value. Morishima's analysis. Conclusion. Chapter 14. Summary statement and implications. A brief assessment. Appendix. Marx on value, money, and price. With the headings: value, money, and price. That's the end of the table of contents. I would like to now we're at the acknowledgments. I should like to thank Perry Anderson, Jay Eatwell, Diane Elson, Norman Garris, and D. Purdy for extensive and extremely helpful discussions around various drafts of this work. Comments were also received from Robin Blackburn, Pat Devine, L. Harris, G. Hodgson, M. Morishima, and R. Rawthorne, and are gratefully acknowledged. Whilst the aforenamed are indeed responsible for the absence of various flaws from the following work, they bear no responsibility for those that remain. In chapters 2, 3, 5, 9, and 10, I have drawn more or less freely on previously published work, and I should like to thank Australian Economic Papers, the Conference of Socialist Economists, New Left Review, and the Economic Journal for permitting me to do so. I am indebted to both Thordis Stephenson and Miss Edith Gillette for her colleagues for the production of an excellent typescript. Ian Steedman, June 1977. And here we are, Chapter 1, Principal Issues and Underlying Assumptions. Sraffa's book, Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities, first published in 1960, had a quite precise purpose, indicated by its subtitle, Prelude to a Critique of Economic Theory. That purpose was to lay the foundation for the criticism of marginalist theories of wages, profits, rents, and prices, a criticism which has now been carried out successfully. It was necessary for Sraffa to consider only a very restricted, albeit crucial, set of issues in economic theory. His central concern was with the relationships which necessarily hold between wages, profits, and prices for given conditions of production, when the wage rate, the rate of profit, and the price of each commodity are uniform throughout the economy. Footnote: Sraffa considers only, quote, prices of production, end quote. His book containing no reference to market prices. The same is true of the present work, end footnote. Sraffa was then able to examine the dependence of prices, of the, quote, value of capital, end quote, and of the choice between alternative methods of production on income distribution, and hence to lay the required basis for the critique of marginalist theory. The relations between wages, profits, prices, and conditions of production, to which Sraffa drew attention so sharply, were quickly seen to provide a foundation not only for the criticism of marginalist theory, but also for the simple, definitive solution of certain issues which had long been debated by Marxists. Footnote: no further reference will be made to rent, since rent and land will not be discussed here. End footnote. Footnote: it should be noted that Sraffa's production of commodities by means of commodities presents no criticisms of Marx. End footnote. The issues in question, while far from exhausting the entire content of Marx's political economy, are not significant ones, and their definitive solutions should have been welcomed by all those working to develop the materialist account of capitalist society. It was not. New section: issues involved. While it would not be appropriate to set out the relevant issues in detail at this point, for to do that is precisely the function of this work, they may be summarized as follows, it being understood that various qualifications and explanations needed will be considered below. On the basis of certain common reasonable assumptions, it may be shown that 1. The conditions of production and the real wage paid to workers, both specified in terms of physical quantities of commodities, suffice to determine the rate of profit, and less importantly, all prices of production. 2. The quantities of labor embodied in the various commodities, which can themselves be determined once the conditions of production are known, thus play no essential role in the determination of the rate of profit or of the prices of production. Footnote. See pages 19 to 20 and pages 208 below for discussion of the relation between, quote, embodied labor time, end quote, and Marx's concept of, quote, value. Three, Marx's solution to the, quote, transformation problem, end quote, is incorrect, not only with respect to prices of production, but also, more importantly, with respect to the rate of profit. The rate of profit in a competitive capitalist economy is not equal in general to surplus value divided by constant capital and variable capital inputs, where surplus value, constant capital, and variable capital are aggregate surplus value, aggregate constant capital, and aggregate variable capital, respectively. Indeed, since the profit rate in all prices of production can be determined without reference to any value magnitude, the, quote, transformation problem, end quote, is a pseudo-problem, a chimera. There is no problem of deriving profits from surplus value and production prices from values to be solved. Four, the social allocation of labor power can be determined without reference to any value magnitude. 5. The relationship between surplus labor and the existence of profits can be established quite independently of Marx's concept of value. 6. There is no a priori basis for establishing any expectation concerning the long-run movement of the rate of profit. New section. The significance of these issues. Marx, like other great theorists, regarded the analysis of the rate of profit as central to a coherent understanding of the workings of a capitalist economy. He saw the rate of profit as being the primary manifestation of surplus labor specific to capitalism. Inevitably, then, he devoted much effort both to the criticism of earlier theories of the profit rate and to the development of his own theory. In that development, he strove constantly to relate the rate of profit to value magnitudes. Consequently, the demonstration that the rate of profit, the prices of production, and the social allocation of labor power can all be determined without any reference to value magnitudes raises questions which are fundamental to the appraisal of Marx's whole project. To say this is not, of course, to reduce Marx's theory to these particular issues. His scope was far wider. The fact remains, nevertheless, that these issues are crucial within Marx's theory, and were known to be so by Marx. To attempt to sidestep them by suggesting that they are marginal issues, or that they belong to a non-Marxist frame of discourse, or that they are mere details without significance for Marx's major work, would be to demean Marx, not to defend Marx. Marx showed only contempt for those who sought to evade the ruthless criticism of ideas. No one can, quote, defend Marx by refusing to follow Marx in this regard. Footnote. To suggest that Marx would not have been concerned with, quote, mere details of logic, end quote, would, of course, be both false and demeaning. New section. Underlying assumptions. It will as well be set out here it will be as well to set out here the underlying assumptions which are to be taken as read in the following chapters, which establish in detail the above mentioned and other findings. These general premises will not be repeated chapter by chapter. New section, or heading. Capitalist commodity economies. The only economies considered are commodity economies, in which all products are produced for exchange, in which production and the allocation of labor power between industries are coordinated solely through the market. Footnote. Non-reproducible goods will not be discussed, whether they be land, minerals, or, quote, oil paintings by Rembrandt, end quote. End footnote. More specifically, the only economies considered are fully developed capitalist commodity economies, in which all production activities are organized and controlled by capitalists or their agents. Production is driven exclusively by the search for profit. All produced means of production are owned by the capitalists, whose money capital is mobile between industries. This mobility of money capital constantly tends to produce a uniform rate of profit. All labor is performed by workers, characterized by their familiar, quote, double freedom, end quote, the freedom to offer their labor power to whichever capitalist they choose, and the freedom from ownership of any land or produced means of production. Workers are thus freely mobile between industries, but the only thing they have to sell is their capacity to work. It need hardly to be said that the object of discussion is thus a, quote, abstract capitalist economy. New heading, production. As has already been stated, all production is assumed to be carried out by workers in a socialized labor process under the direction and control of the capitalists or their agents, using produced means of production and producing products, all of which are the property of the capitalist. That the production process is thus a social process, and that the process is initiated and controlled for the sole purpose of making profits does not, of course, alter the fact that the physical inputs, the labor done and the physical outputs produced, stand in certain necessary relations to one another. The following analyses will generally start from such conditions of production. It should be noted carefully that the procedure of starting an analysis from the relations between physically specified inputs. It should be noted carefully that the conditions of starting an analysis from the relations between physically specified inputs, amounts of labor time, and physically specified outputs has the following negative and properties. 1. It does not involve a denial of the social nature of the capitalist production process. 2. It does not involve a denial that coercion is exercised and resisted in the capitalist production process. Indeed, it can be used to analyze these phenomena. 3. It does not imply that the conditions of production applying in a given capitalist economy in a given period are independent of the economic, scientific, cultural, and political history and situation of that economy, or of the, quote, balance of forces, end quote, between workers and capitalists in the workplace. 4. It does not entail concern with use values and concrete labor to the exclusion of exchange value and abstract labor. All commodities will be seen below as both use values and exchange values, and all labor will be seen as both concrete and abstract labor. As will be seen in the sequel, when the object of discussion is, say, the relation between wages, profits, and prices of production, the production relations will be, quote, frozen and taken as determined exogenously. This merely amounts to assuming that the various determinants of production relations, including the shop floor balance of forces, are hypothetically held constant. This does not, of course, mean that the role of these determinants is denied. It is merely a procedure for focusing attention on one problem at a time. When, however, the object of discussion is, say, the effect of speed up in the labor process, or the effects of technical change on the rate of profit, those same production relations will necessarily be, quote, unfrozen. These procedural remarks should help to explain the treatment of, quote, labor power in the text which follows. Whenever the workplace balance of forces is held, quote, frozen, because that balance is not the immediate object of inquiry, the purchase of a given capacity to work at a given wage will lead to the performance of a given amount of labor. The conceptual distinction between, quote, labor power and, quote, labor, of course, remains, but its importance lapses provisionally under the given assumptions. That is why the distinction is often not emphasized below. It is not, however, rejected and will indeed be employed when it has force. For example, in discussing variations in the working day, the speed and intensity of work, and so on. There will no doubt be some who will continue to insist that it is, quote, un-Marxist, end quote, ever to take conditions of production as the starting point of one's analysis. Footnote. Only those with the shortest memories can be unaware of the dangers of attempting to, quote, deal with arguments by labeling them, quote, un-Marxist. And footnote. Marx, it need hardly be said, had more sense as the following testifies, quote, the fact that the production of use values or goods is carried on under the control of a capitalist and on his behalf does not alter the general character of that production. We shall therefore in the first place have to consider the labor process independently of any specific social formation. End quote. New heading. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. New heading, reproduction. The capitalist economy is considered or always in a self-reproducing state, whether the reproduction be, quote, simple or, quote, expanded, stationary or growing, so that production, exchange, and distribution are always considered as a unity. Since capitalists will remain capitalists and workers remain workers, the social relations of production are reproduced, as well as the means of production. For the most part, reproduction will be taken to be, quote, simple. The reason for this is not, of course, that simple reproduction is typical of capitalist systems. It is that many of the questions discussed below do not depend on the nature of the reproduction involved, so that it is obviously sensible to consider them in the context of the, quote, simple case. New heading. Labor, time, value, money, and price. Unless otherwise stated, all labor is taken to be unskilled, quote, simple labor, all labor being of equal ability and equal, quote, intensity. Any worker can perform every kind of, quote, concrete labor. All productive activities of a given kind are assumed to be carried out under identical conditions with equal efficiency, so that each individual expenditure of labor time is an expenditure of socially necessary labor time. The impossible task of adding together quantities of different concrete labor times will not be attempted, it may be noted. Exclamation point. Footnote. Gerstein, see footnote 13, actually makes the mistake of asserting that abstract labor as such never appears in the Sraffa-based critique, which he says considers only concrete labor. This assertion could hardly be more wide of the mark. As will be seen in the later chapters, the total labor time embodied in, say, a car is represented as the sum of the labor time spent in assembling the car, and that spent in making the steel, etc., used by car workers, that spent in producing iron ore, coal, electricity, and so on for use in making the steel, etc., etc. The very fact that these different labor times expended in a capitalist economy are added together means that they are treated as abstract labor time. One can add 7 hours of concrete coal mining labor to 3 hours of concrete tea making labor, and that 7 apples to 3 oranges. In parenthesis. End footnote. All summations of labor times are summations of quantities of abstract labor. It is to be taken as read throughout the exchange of commodities that the exchange of commodities takes place via the medium of money, that money will seldom be referred to explicitly, and that the functions of money, other than the medium of exchange function, are not discussed, is to be attributed to the fact that the obviously very important issues of crises, quote, effective demand, quote, Say's law, and so on, are abstracted from, reproduction being assumed to take place smoothly. The foregoing assumptions entail that the magnitude of value is a quantity of embodied labor time. This will often be abbreviated to the statement that, quote, value equals embodied labor time, end quote, an abbreviation used by Marx. And now this is a big question within the reception of Marx. What does embodied mean? Or what is the metaphysical? What is the, or not metaphysical? What is the metaphysical. What is the ontological status of value? The way that was being talked earlier about abstract labor being a concrete quantum, which in Marx there definitely is ambiguities, is noted by Michael Heinrich. But the sensible one is the purely social conception of abstract labor, and not the one that is physicalist, or what's the word that he uses? Substantialist. The idea that there's some kind of actual labor time in the commodities themselves, that value is something that's in commodities in themselves. I feel like that's one of the main aspects of, and I'm sure he hasn't used the word fetishism yet, but that's one of the main purposes of fetishism, is to critique. In my view, it only makes sense if it's used as like a critique of something, of the notion that commodities or labor products as such have value. If value is just embodied labor time, then value is a transhistorical category, because all human labor products have a concrete time that they took to produce, right? Sorry, I'm getting off track here. The foregoing assumptions entail that the magnitude of value is a quantity of embodied labor time. This will often be abbreviated to the statement that, quote, value equals embodied labor time, end quote, an abbreviation used by Marx. It will be clear to the serious reader that, since only capitalist commodity economies are considered, this abridgment involves no denial of Marx's statements concerning the, quote, form of value, end quote, abstract social labor, the, quote, universal equivalent, end quote, and so on. The prices considered throughout this work are always prices of production, for market prices are never considered. It should perhaps be remarked that, by definition, prices of production are the prices which would obtain in the hypothetical presence of a uniform rate of profit. The concepts of a uniform rate of profit and the prices of production are indissolubly related, is for this reason and not because the determination of prices of production is a major theoretical concern in its own right. That prices of production will appear frequently in the sequel. If one is concerned to explain the rate of profit, then, ipso facto, one must be concerned with prices of production. Footnote: the supposedly rhetorical question, who is interested in prices, that can be left to bourgeois theory, thus simply embodies a confusion. The answer to the question is anyone concerned to provide a serious theory of the rate of profit in particular, and of the laws of motion of capitalism in general. End footnote. New heading, wages. Wages are treated in this work, as they were by Marx, as being exogenously determined, exogenously determined, in terms of a specific bundle of commodities, in a given economy in a given period. Naturally, one does not thereby deny that wages are socially determined or that they change over time. It should go without saying that to assume an exogenously given wage is not to assume a wage providing only a biological subsistence level of living. At some points in the following chapters, the wage is taken to be paid in advance. In others, it is assumed to be paid ex post, at the end of the cycle of production. It is to be noted with care that the varying choice of assumption is dictated purely by the resulting convenience for the analysis in hand. Nothing will be said on the basis of either assumption, which could not also be said mutatis mutandis, using the other assumption, and any reader who feels incorrectly that the choice between these assumptions is important can always make the appropriate change in assumption. No essential change will result in the conclusions, provided that they are correctly drawn. Footnote: Gerstein asserts that the assumption that wages are paid ex post involves, quote, ideological bias, end quote, and the view that workers and capitalists, quote, share the net product. In fact, of course, if wages are taken as given, no question of, quote, sharing the net product arises, whether those wages are paid at the beginning or the end of the production period. This lapse provides a, quote, good example of an emotional response to a simple but misunderstood point of reasoning. Gerstein is also wrong to say, quote, there are in general n solutions for R. Presumably the largest is the one that corresponds to the actual rate of profit, end quote. It is, of course, well known that the economically relevant solution is actually the smallest of the mathematical solutions. As a side note, just because the worker is paid later does not mean that the sale of labor power happens after labor power has been performed. End footnote. New section. The obscurantist response. The response of many Marxists to the kind of results presented in this book has been not to face them, but to obscure them, not to consider their validity or implications, but to ignore them and to, quote, justify this response by merely asserting correctly that Marx was concerned with wider issues. It should be transparently clear that from this correct assertion, nothing follows concerning the validity of the various propositions in question. The obscurants often also allege incorrectly that those engaged in the derivation of such propositions either ignore or even deny many of Marx's essential insights. The usual basis for such allegations is the mere absence from the arguments involved of lengthy rehearsals of Marx's basic ideas, as if one necessarily denied the truth of all those propositions, whose truth one does not explicitly affirm! Such demands for the constant repetition of basic ideas perhaps indicate how shallow are the roots of the recent revival of Marxist culture. As is to be expected, the different obscurantists do not all make exactly the same allegations against the Marx critique, based on the work of Sraffa, but it is not difficult to construct from their writings a, quote, composite allegation, end quote, which encompasses all of the most common specific complaints. Footnote. Oh, there's a footnote no, never mind. No, there's multiple footnotes. Footnote. The term, quote, critique is, of course, used here not in the sense of totally negative, dismissive criticism, but rather to mean criticism leading to a new theory embodying the strengths of the old, but shedding its weaknesses. End footnote. Footnote. The more responsible, quote, defenses of Marx against the Sraffa-based critique include B. Fine and L. Harris in their article Controversial Issues in Marxist Economic Theory, published in the Socialist Register in 1976. I. Gerstein's article Production, Circulation, and Value, published in Economy and Society in 1976. R. B. Rawthorne's article Neoclassicism, Neo-Ricardianism, and Marxism, published in New Left Review in 1974. See the first two of these three articles for extensive bibliographies, including references to all the various works from which the allegation has been composited. End footnote. Footnote. If I have omitted any important item from the composite allegation, the omission is not intended, but is due to oversight. End footnote. New section, the composite allegation. The type of argument exemplified in the present text is flawed. It is alleged by the following, in some cases interconnected, quote, failures. A. It is asocial and ahistorical, failing to represent capitalism as a specific mode of production. In particular, relations of production are viewed in a purely, quote, natural, non-social way, and capital is not seen as a social relation. Alternatively, is seen as a social relation only with respect to questions of distribution. The analysis is purely formal. B. It is concerned only with exchange and distribution, paying little or no attention to the process of production. C. Insofar as production is considered, it is seen as purely natural. A purely natural technical matter, not a social process. Even if social relations are considered with respect to distribution, they are not considered in the context of production. D. The coercion, direction, and control of the labor process by capitalists or their agents is not discussed, nor therefore is worker resistance to that doctrine. E. It does not deal with the dynamic of capitalism, with accumulation or with crises. F. It is concerned only with quantitative matters to the complete exclusion of qualitative issues. Thus, quote, value is seen merely as embodied labor time, the, quote, form of value, and, quote, being entirely ignored. Marx's concepts of concrete labor, abstract labor, value, and labor power are either misrepresented or are actually rejected. G. The source or, quote, origin of profit is not explained, and the concepts of surplus labor and surplus value are ignored or rejected. New section. The allegation is specious. To the reader familiar with Marx's work, the composite allegation presented above might well appear, if well founded, to constitute a severe indictment of the Sraffa-based critique of Marx, but it would be a paradox indeed if such a reader were content to consider only the superficial appearance of things. Careful consideration of the underlying assumptions set out above will show at once that some of the particular allegations are unfounded. It has already been stated that the obscurantes evade the issues involved rather than meet them head-on. This may now be considered further in the context of the composite allegation. Suppose purely for the sake of argument that allegations A, B, C, D, E, and F were fully justified, which they are not. This would mean that the Sraffa-based critique of Marx is concerned only with a restricted, precisely defined range of issues, which may or may not have further ramifications. Saying nothing one way or the other on most aspects of Marx's thought. It would not mean that the arguments which are actually put forward in such a critique are false. It would not mean that the arguments which are actually put forward in such a critique are false. Footnote: this point is well understood by some. Thus, Rawthorne, in the article cited above, provides a forceful presentation of allegations A to E, yet being well versed in the logical content of the relevant arguments, he at no point rejects any one of the conclusions reached in the Sraffa-based critique of Marx. He merely says that the scope of the argument in question is limited. The point is perhaps less clearly taken by some of those who have quoted Rawthorne's paper. End footnote. This crucial fact is easily overlooked in the midst of lengthy disquisitions on the historicity of modes of production, the centrality of production as a social process, the unrelenting shop floor struggle between workers and capitalists, the essentially dynamic nature of capitalism, or the form of value. Such discourses may show that their authors have read Marx, but they do nothing to meet the Sraffa-based critique of Marx. More specifically, whatever the extent and the importance of Marx's treatment of the form of value, Marx did make important statements concerning embodied labor time, the magnitude of value, and the determination of the general rate of profit and of prices of production. Some of these statements have been shown to be false. That fact cannot be altered and ought not to be obscured by incessant recitations of Marx's other views and statements concerning the, quote, form of value or anything else, or by misleading suggestions that the issues involved here are peripheral to Marx's work. Similarly, the correct assertions that the Sraffa-based critique of Marx seldom refer explicitly to the concepts of concrete labor, abstract labor and labor power provide no basis for the rational rejection of that critique. Element G of the composition allegation has both an explicit and an implicit aspect. The explicit charge that the Sraffa-based critique of Marx makes no reference to surplus labor or surplus value is either quite simply false or is a variant of on the charge that, quote, value, as understood by Marx, is never fully discussed. The implicit aspect lies in the suggestion that Sraffa-based theories give only a, quote, superficial explanation of the existence of profits in terms of distribution and exchange, while Marx's arguments provide a, quote, essential, a, quote, real explanation in terms of production. The first half of this suggestion is only a variant of elements A to E, considered above, while its second half is simply false or will emerge from the following chapters. As will emerge from the following chapters. Bracket. The issue of, quote, superficial, end quote, explanations perhaps deserves a further remark, which has a bearing on many aspects of the composite allegation and which should be noted clearly. If it is said that, e.g., the rate of profit is determined by A, B, and C, it is always possible to ask, yes, but what determines A, B, and C? That being so, whatever are A, B, and C? That question will always be legitimate in some frame of reference, but it must not be taken to mean that the determination in terms of A, B, and C is invalid. Many of the supposed, quote, defenses of Marx against the Sraffa-based critique have amounted to no more than the implicit denial of this simple truth, end bracket. As a refutation of the Sraffa-based critique, the composite allegation and all of its elements are completely specious. Footnote: much less important than the question whether the Sraffa-based critique of Marx is open to the composite allegation, parenthesis, it is not, in parenthesis, is the question whether the Sraffa-based critics of Marx have or have not been aware of the various issues raised, irrelevantly by the obscurants. The appropriate evidence being largely anecdotal and circumstantial, the space necessary to show that they have generally been aware of these aspects of Marx's thought will be out of all proportion to the small importance of the question. I merely state that I have always been so aware. End footnote. The resounding phrases and lofty themes often found in such allegations serve only to obscure the issues at hand. The Sraffa-based critique of Marx cannot be met head-on and rationally rejected, for the simple reason that it is correct. Thus, the self-appointed, quote, defenders of Marx descend into evasion. The issues involved, it is sad but true, have been the object of long and often fruitless debate. It is time to acknowledge that they can be resolved and to consider the further ramifications of that necessary resolution. There is no legitimate excuse for further evasion concerning the Sraffa-based critique of Marx. In particular, has been set out at some length above. The critique cannot be airily dismissed as belonging to a different frame of discourse. Footnote: it is incumbent on those who would seek to evade the Sraffa-based critique by such a move to show just how their precisely stated definitions and assumptions are both such as to assist one's understanding of capitalism, not such as to be open to the Sraffa-based critique. End footnote. The Sraffa-based results are not only correct, but derive from arguments which do not depend on ignoring or rejecting Marx's basic materialist framework. Footnote: nothing has been or will be said here concerning Marx's work on commodity fetishism, reification, and related issues. It may well be that creative thinkers inspired by Marx's work on these matters will produce further insights into the nature of capitalist societies. One can be confident, however, that such creative work will derive no inspiration whatsoever from the mere repetition, often in language far less compelling than in that of the original, of what Marx wrote. It may be noted that Marx's ideas in this field bear no intrinsic relation to the questions whether production prices are determined by values, whether profit equals surplus value, and so on. They relate rather to certain features of the capitalist commodity-producing economy which are taken as read throughout this work. End footnote. Furthermore, they relate not to marginal but to central issues in Marx's theory. As was remarked above, Marx was himself well aware of the importance of his sound theory of the rate of profit and prices of production for the proper understanding of a capitalist economy and its development. The appropriate response of Marxists to the Sraffa-based critique of Marx is thus not to evade it or obscure it, but to grasp it, to absorb it, and to use it in the construction of an improved theory of the capitalist economy. New section, the structure of the present work. Chapters 2 to 5 below present alternative discussions of the underlying issue of the determination of the rate of profit in a capitalist economy. It is shown in varied ways and at various levels of generality that no value magnitude plays any essential role in that determination. Each of these chapters is based on the simplifying assumption that only circulating capital is used and that no pure joint products are produced. The same assumptions are adopted in chapters 6 to 8, which deal with a number of extensions to the arguments of chapters 2 to 5, showing how variations within the labor process, heterogeneous labor, differential wages, certain turnover problems, etc., may be treated within the, quote, physical quantities, end quote, framework of analysis advocated throughout this book. After a discussion of the, quote, falling rate of profit, end quote, in chapter 9, attention is turned in chapters 10 to 13 to the analysis of fixed capital using and joint product producing capitalist economies. While certain additional complexities naturally arise with the introduction of fixed capital, etc., it is shown that the central findings of the simpler analyses of chapters 2 to 8 are little affected. Under simple reasonable assumptions, the physical conditions of production and real wages suffice to determine the rate of profit, all prices of production, which methods of production are used, at what age machines are scrapped, the social allocation of labor power, and so on. No value magnitude is of the slightest relevance to that determination. It will be concluded, therefore, that Marx's value magnitude reasoning should be abandoned by those working to develop the materialist account of the capitalist economy. No claim to significant originality is made for the arguments presented below. On the contrary, the far more significant claim that the arguments given below are correct is buttressed by the fact that many of the results presented here have been obtained by various writers. Footnote. See, for example, G. Abraham Froid et E. Berebi's book, Théorie de la valeur, des prix et des accumulations, published in 1976. L. von Bortkiewicz, I'm not sure how to pronounce that names. His paper, Bortkiewicz's paper, Value and Price in the Marxian System, published in International Economic Papers, 1952. This is an English translation of the second and third parts of a 3-part article originally published in German. A. Brody's paper, Prices, Proportions, and Planning, a mathematical restatement of the labor theory of value. V.K. Dmitriev, Economic Essays on Value, Competition, and Utility, published in 1974. The first essay, which is the one relevant to the present work, was first published in Russia in 1898. 5. P. Garignani, I capitale nelle teorie della distribuzione. That's just my guess. And M. Lippi, I think it's Marco Lippi, Marx il valore come costo sociale reale, published in 1976. And footnote. The object of the book is to present well-established results in a coherent and, as far as possible, simple way. Footnote. Mathematical arguments have, as far as possible, been preceded by simple numerical examples. The mathematical, quote, level of the argument is thus oscillatory, not ever increasing, and the reader who finds a particular section difficult is therefore encouraged to press forward, since any attempt to satisfy both mathematical and non-mathematical readers is doomed to failure. I have steered towards the interest of the latter. To the former, He might have preferred a less informal argument in certain passages. I can only apologize and swear an oath that the informality does not reflect any contempt for rigorous argument! Exclamation point. It may also be noted here, with respect to those chapters which are based on previously published papers, no attempt has been made to polish away every element of repetition or difference of emphasis. End footnote. The objective of the book is to present well-established results in a coherent and, as far as possible, simple way, emphasizing that arguments entirely consistent with Marx's materialist analysis both provide answers to some of the important questions with which Marx grappled and show that his value-magnitude analysis is irrelevant to those answers. That's the end of the chapter. The footnote that had that was saying all the things that are consistent with Steedman's approach. He had more books on the next page. M. Morishima, Marx's Economics, A Dual Theory of Value and Growth. 8. M. Morishima, Marx in the Light of Modern Economic Theory. 9. N. Okishio, A Mathematical Note on Marxian Theorems, published in 1963. It might be wondered whether Marx after Dmitriev or Marx after Bortkiewicz might not be a proper title for the present work, but Sraffa's work has proved to mark a turning point by providing a rigorous framework of analysis within which the pioneering works of Dmitriev and Bortkiewicz become important special cases. Thank you so much for listening.